And the topic I'm going to talk about today is one of the favorite topics that, in my opinion, my topic, we have been working on rainfall extremes for quite some time already, back from when I was in Broward and now also at South Florida Water Management District. We collaborate very closely with the USGS. So everything that I'm going to be sharing today here, Johnn can come in and chime in because he has even more knowledge than I do in terms of what does that mean and really all the processes and the techniques we are using to assess regional climate stressors, and mainly the rainfall, which is still a piece of the climate change that we do not fully read, that we cannot fully understand. Before I jump into the rainfall, we have been working on repository of data at South Florida Water Management District. It's our water and climate resilience metrics. This is mostly observed data. We monitor quite a large amount of data at South Florida Water Management District, water and climate related data. And what we initiated so far is looking at those observations to understand what kind of trends we have and what does that mean. So we began selecting 15 metrics that we knew we had enough data, like long periods of records. And we start assessing that using like statistical techniques to let us know if we do have a trend, if we don't, and what are some of the influencing factors on that trend. This is a long research. It's not like we had made some progress, but it's not like a quick endeavor. We have published data on where we found trends and really access to the data. And we're also able to link to real-time data. So the trends are not like obsolete. We are really kind of maintaining the data assessment up and running, and also the data available to the public. And what we have now in the portal published, it's rainfall, so data on rainfall, some observed rainfall trends, data on sea level rise. We do have, in addition to NOAA data, we have gauges all along the coast where we have coastal structures. So we have a really distributed network of measurements along the coast, both in the west and the east coast, really adding up to the data that NOAA has been published in terms of sea level rise. We have data on saltwater intrusion. We partner with utilities as well to understand saltwater concentration nearby the coastal areas, especially nearby the well fields that are close to our coast. So this is also all published there. We have groundwater levels. So we are also monitoring changes in groundwater level patterns and really publishing what we have. And from the natural environmental side, we have our larger restoration efforts, and data that we have that are beginning to become relevant to this analysis are peat accumulation. So we are monitoring, we have research with FIU to help us understand soil accumulation, peat accumulation, soil accretion in some of the areas, losses and gains. We also have data on salinity in the estuaries, and we have data on blanking now. I will remember, I cannot read. We have also data on migration, estuary migration, different types of vegetation and how they are migrating inland, and how we can start monitoring that. So all this data, again, is published. It's available to the public, and we are going to continue to bring new data. And not only that, but really additional data analysis that will help us explain how climate might be related to that, what other influencing factors we have, and what does that mean. And of course, one of the major data sets that we have been spending time in assessing and understanding the impacts from a water management perspective is rainfall. Here I'm sharing with you the data that we were able to observe since the 1935 up to today in terms of rainfall events. We are plotting that there in this chart only wet season. So it's wet season averages throughout those years in the Southwest Florida coast. And in this case, we detected an upward trend. So meaning that during the wet season, we might see more intense storms occurring in this region. This doesn't mean that we cannot have other conditions in the dry season that might be pointing us to excessive dry events, drought. in general, what we are seeing is not a lot of change if we look at average annuals, but we are looking at more extremes, both from the wet and the dry side. In terms of projections, I share that this website is really focused on observations, but we are, of course, bringing some of the projections up for us to understand how we can better plan for those into the future. Based on some trends and observations that we are seeing, it's not just like simple extrapolation into the future. It requires significant work to understand what climate models are telling us and how can we interpret that. There is work in sea level rise projections everywhere in the US, everywhere in the world at this point. Rainfall, as I mentioned before, is a little bit still behind in terms of research, but we are making initial progress as well on trying to understand how can we really be assessing rainfall conditions into the future. This workshop back in 2019 helped us to lay out a plan on how we wanted to approach studying projections in Florida. We focus on South Florida, but it can be extended to the state. But so we established a plan that in the short term, we would be looking at available downscaling data sets. So global climate models that were developed for the entire US and organizations like climate experts that have been downscaling these global climate models to a resolution that allow us to understand what can happen in a more regional scale, not even local, but I would say more regional scale. So we look at, I would say, almost everything that we have available in terms of downscaling data sets up to the time we published this research. We have not yet spent too much time on the newer data sets that were more recently published, the CMIP6. Our research ended mostly when the CMIP5 data was published, but we do have more data now coming, and we will continue on this path too to see if there is any additional learning that we can get. And then in terms of long-term strategy, we propose the development of what we call a regional climate model. So it's really a more refined climate model. We are working right now with the USGS and other partners to understand exactly what that means. We are working at the state. I will share a little bit more with you later. But what we have is almost something that we could get to a 1 kilometer regional climate model that can really capture the mechanisms of rainfall in Florida. We have a very particular state and conditions that really influence on how rainfall occurs here, not only talking about tropical storms, but many other conditions. And we need to be able to have a model that can help us capture how rainfall occur here. So that's the path of the long term that we are initiating right now at this state. What we have in the website right now is the data that we were able to assess in terms of available downscaling data sets. We have a web app there that shows the data that we compile for South Florida, all 16 counties. We also broke the data by rainfall region. And this website, this link provides access to all the reports and scientific information that was produced throughout the study. So you can get access not only to the data in a more like summarized way that is easy for organizations to really apply the data into their assessments, but you can also get all the science and really the details at the very, like, I would say, very specific table that has all the conditions that were assessed throughout the study. And this is mainly through this portal. This is the USGS portal that was published as part of this study. This is a data release, meaning that the codes, the data, the original data, the results of the assessments, everything is available for anybody that wants to use, applying other types of research, and also understand how the process was developed. So this is linked also in the portal there. And one additional product that we have is something that the Water Management District produced based on the data release from USGS. The data release from the USGS, the way we like to say, is the pure scientific analysis. And what we had to do is how can we best interpret, how can we best try to apply those results in our mission, like in the Water Management District mission, which is water management. So this is a more like, it's a memorandum just explaining how we got the data from the USGS and how we're going to be applying it, and how the change factors, we call it change factor, is the percentage of increase in extreme rainfall into the future, how they were adopted for the 16 counties and rainfall regions in South Florida. To give you just a quick glance, what does that mean in terms of results? We have published this for all the 16 counties and rainfall regions. And what you can see is that there is uncertainty. I will begin by saying that those bars can be much wider. We are here just showing 25, 75 percentile of the results, and varying between like maybe 1%, 2% increase all the way to 35% increase in rainfall. In average, what we see is about 20%. In like a rough number is 15-20% increase 50 years from now. So we center the analysis in 2070. So as you can see, there is, as I said, some variance in the results there. And this is really due to the lack of capacity to have a more refined model to help us understand, and really the variety of global climate models that are being produced in the region. Another way to see the data, and I'm plotting here just for Southwest coastal rainfall area, and also Southwest coastal, I thought it was county and the area, but it's the 3-day and the 1-day. So what you have here is like the range, as I said, for a 3-day 100-year event, we are talking about 21% increase, but understand that we have this uncertainty range also plotted there in something around 20% as well when we look at the 1-day. So into the future, for a 1-day event, 100-year return frequency, what we are estimating is about 20% increase. And we have the values for all the different rainfall frequencies. And again, we also have them plotted by county. And how do we use that? So the two main applications from the South Florida Water Management District perspective have been our flood protection level of service program. We have this program to assess flood vulnerabilities that we are running for about 8 to 9 years now. We really assess on a basin by basin scale how our system is performing. We have flood control system, a significant water management flood control system in those regions. We call it the CNSF system, Central and Southern Florida project, that was built back in the 1940s. So we are assessing the performance of the system and what's the level of service that we have in those basins based on current and future conditions. So rainfall has been incorporated into the program on the 2 more recent assessments after we published this study. So Palm Beach County and Upper Kissimmee Basin now are running scenarios that also account not only for sea level rise that we have been accounting for many years, but also now accounting for potential changes in rainfall. And what does that mean in terms of infrastructure investments to continue to maintain adequate level of service, flood protection level of service in those areas. And we have our sea level rise and flood resiliency plan that also lists those projects that we are recommending as part of those assessments. So really helping us to understand how many projects, how big is the endeavor, and what is the path that we need to begin upgrading and updating our system. And other measures that we know are going to be important from a flood protection perspective, but also linking some of the water supply and some ecosystem restoration efforts that we do. And to end my presentation here, before I jump to next steps, I'm just going to touch one point that I was discussing with Jennifer a few times, and I'm going to start with the more graphic engineering image here, but I produce another slide that helps us understand that too. And the way we are seeing that, and again, this is a water management perspective, how we see that rainfall is impacting our future there. So in terms of, there is one example that I'm going to use here is how we size reservoirs. So for us to understand the storage needs, the basic concept is how much you have in terms of gaps, not on your average, but really from the extreme wet to the extreme dry. So you kind of have to navigate on a process that you kind of compile numbers that you go like from evaluating what you have in terms of your most deficits and what you have in terms of excess water. So basically that's it. You would know how much you have in average, what's your deficit in some times of the year, usually the dry season, and how much surplus you have during the wet season. So this is kind of how you size your reservoir needs. And what you can see here is that you kind of account and you go like adding those numbers, and you can add like what's the ideal reservoir capacity. When we jump to a more extreme weather, what we are seeing is those peaks are higher. So you can observe from the darker colors there that you might have, that we are anticipating to have more extreme wet. So your peaks during the wet season are higher, and also some extreme dry. So your peaks in the drier season, your really down peaks are going to be also more extreme. So basically by doing this math, and this is not any real number, this is just an exercise, assuming that we have 10% increase in excess rainfall and 10% increase in lack of rainfall during the dry season. What we have in terms of storage needs is an increase in 17%. Again, this number, please don't use this number as a main reference. This is just an exercise, but just to understand that by fluctuating these extremes, we really increase our need to store more water to be able to provide not only to store water during the dry season and prevent flood, but also to have water available for when we need in the dry season to really provide the ecosystem needs, the human needs, to avoid like excess drought and the impacts from droughts. So in a more illustrative format, what does that mean is just like a wetter wet season will really cause more intense and frequent floods. A drier dry season will cause more intense and more frequent droughts. And what we need, one of the responses that we really need to understand this is that we'll need to store more water to be able to use throughout the year. So this is definitely something that we have been working on, looking to identify how we can do that sustainably in a green way, in a more traditional engineering way. But really, one of the big pieces that we need here is to store more water. Some of our next steps that we are working. So we have a new partnership with the USGS and Florida International University. Johnn is the supervisor of the partnership here to really look at drought extremes. All the results that I share with you is wet extremes. So with a flood perspective, we're going to now look at the same data sets to understand what does that mean in terms of drought extremes. We have a plan and we have laid out an approach on how we want to do a water supply vulnerability assessment. So we're going to begin looking at that in the Lower East Coast region for South Florida. We have a model in place that is, we are bringing the module that we need to be able to evaluate water supply vulnerability assessments. We're going to begin running that in the fall this year, later in the fall, and we are preparing the data for how we can bring the drought extremes to this simulation. We are going to continue to refine our analysis. So I talk about CMIP6 data. We are coordinating to see how we can bring this available data that can perhaps reduce uncertainties and enhance the data that we have. And we are continue to look at rainfall observations as a whole. We are moving to a sub-daily step. We never really look at like 6 hours, and something that we noticed from Ian, the more extreme occurrences that happened during Ian was really at the 12-hour scale, not even on a daily scale, even though the daily scale was already like a 200-year return frequency from a 6-hour event. I think Obi, FIU, a researcher, got up to more than 500 return frequency. And we are continuing to coordinate all of this work, especially at the state level, is now being coordinated through the Florida Flood Hub. This is an entity that has been established last year, 2 years ago, through Senate Bill 1954. They are really looking at sea level rise projections, rainfall projections, and how we can represent that in terms of flood risks, but they are integrating also the drought aspect there. So we are beginning to coordinate with a lot of partners to advance what we call a statewide regional climate projection, which will be our model that we need to really understand and project rainfall and evapotranspiration, which we're going to transition now to the state of Florida, and really collaborating with all the agencies that need and will be using this data. Thank you.
We're now going to go to our virtual presenter, Dr. Reimer. Are you on the line?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great.
Feel free to go ahead when you're ready. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. I'm coming to you all this morning from sunny but very cold Pennsylvania. So I wish I was in the room, but unfortunately not today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about acidification around coastal Florida, what acidification is, and who the groups are that have been supporting this effort and work around basically the entire Gulf of Mexico and Southeast region in the last few years. Next slide, please. So the coastal acidification networks, there are 6 of us around the country, and we're funded through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we're essentially, at least for my CAN, which is Southeast, and we cover Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. We're a group of scientists, but also stakeholders. And in this case, we consider stakeholders to be anybody that has any interest in the coastal region. So whether that's researchers, resource managers, communication specialists, educators, homeowners, everybody is important. And our mission is to work directly with our stakeholders, but also to make sure that we're synthesizing and communicating the state of ocean acidification science to stakeholders and meeting any kind of community regional needs. So that can be anything from monitoring to data assessment to just providing educational materials and resource materials. Next slide, please. So coastal acidification is a water quality problem. It is also a climate issue, and I will tell you why it's both in just a minute. Next, please. So some of you might be asking, what exactly is acidification? It is defined as a CO2 increase in the water that causes a pH or acidity decrease, which can be harmful to biota. But it's also important to remember that not all low pH conditions are necessarily harmful. There is a wide range of pH that many systems can tolerate, but then there are pH ranges where systems become threatened. So when we talk about pH, we're talking about the free-floating hydrogen ions that are dissolved in water. And there's not a direct one-to-one relationship between the pH scale, which are these colored bars that you can see, and the direct concentration of hydrogen ions, which means that even very small changes in the pH can affect animals, whereas those where the concentration might not. And just to kind of give you an idea of pH range, normal seawater is considered to be about 8.1, and you can see I put in little waves on the scales. And just some common examples would be like your stomach acid is a pH of 1, soap is a pH of 12. So in general, ocean water is considered to be in the neutral range, kind of in the middle. Next slide, please. So how do we measure it? Well, we can directly measure several different biogeochemical characteristics by taking water samples, and then we take them back to laboratories around the state of Florida and other coastal states, and we measure directly from our samples. Sometimes we might need to calculate pH, and sometimes we can measure it directly. When we're out in the field and we want to take those water samples, we can also use instruments to measure directly in the surface water. And we can also take deeper samples by using instruments to collect deep water samples. We use cruises. There are a number of fixed platforms such as buoys and pylons. Some of you might have even seen some in Tampa Bay. And we also take discretely sampled or discrete measurements at different sites. And as you can see in that middle picture, we have a student that's just taking a water sample, right, just walking in to the water, or we can even drop a Niskin bottle from a pier. So we're pretty diverse in the way that we can collect our data. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm going to start to tell you a little bit about climate versus just a water quality issue. So acidification in the open ocean and in larger basins of water is caused by elevated atmospheric CO2, which dissolves into the surface water. And we know that CO2 in the atmosphere has been increasing since the Industrial Revolution, and it's directly related to the amount of CO2 emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. So where does that CO2 go? Well, it goes into the surface water. And so this the seawater CO2 has been increasing at roughly the same rate as the atmosphere on average since the Industrial Revolution back in the late 1700s. So the increased CO2 comes from two very distinctive sources, and we know that it's from fossil fuel burning, but land use change, which means that if you cut down trees and processes like deforestation, you're cutting down and removing plants that would otherwise store the CO2 and prevent it from going into the atmosphere and then into the ocean. So on this larger graph on the right-hand side, you can see that the atmospheric CO2 is the red line, and it's been increasing since we've been measuring it in the atmosphere since the late 1950s. And then that green line is when we started measuring surface ocean CO2. And this is all coming from the Hawaii time series that's been NOAA funded since the mid 80s. And then that blue line is that pH decrease. So that's why pH is a climate issue, because it changes over long periods of time. And those squiggles in the line are changes in pH that we can see on smaller time scales, such as we can see changes in pH as low as tidal scales, daily time scales, seasonal, and then the decadal that we're showing on this graph. So while the CO2 in the water and the air is increasing, the pH is decreasing. So that's the important take-home message here. Next slide, please. But the coastal ocean, So just to give you a brief rundown of what's happening, and there are a lot of chemical reactions that occur in the surface ocean, but I'm not going to get into them today. You have the carbon dioxide dissolves into the surface and it mixes with the water to create carbonic acid. So that causes that decrease in pH, and with the excess CO2 affects the different types of carbon that are available in the seawater for plants and animals to use to grow. So an example of that is in this laboratory experiment that exposed marine pteropods, which are a small, tiny planktonic animal, to elevated CO2 over 15 to 30 to 45 days, the shell actually deteriorated. So the acidification affects species, habitats, all the way up to full ecosystems. Next, please. So when we move into the coastal zone, we don't just have the absorption of atmospheric CO2. We're also concerned about local processes, and many of those are listed here. So I'll go through them. So eutrophication, which is an excess of nutrients that cause increased algae, phytoplankton, and plant blooms. And so first, that CO2 is taken out of the water by photosynthesis, but then when you have large blooms, as these cells die off and decay, they release CO2 back into the water column. So that's where photosynthesis and plants, they provide us with removal of CO2, but they also put it back in. Ocean currents and tides can transport acidified waters into the coastal zone. Freshwater inputs bring lower pH water that has higher CO2 than coastal waters to the coastal zone, and that's just inherently rivers, streams, and groundwater have a lower pH. Stormwater runoff is also a concerning factor because not only is it fresh water, but it's picking up any other nutrients off of the land and bringing them into the ocean. Septic leaching is a direct source of nutrients that can cause the plants to bloom again, and then more CO2 as they decay. And then other effluent sources. However, there is kind of a bright note here that with adequate resource management, we can mitigate the decreasing pH. And Tampa Bay is a great example of that I'm going to come back to in a little bit. So if we can control point source output, regulate fertilizers, and manage stormwater, we can mitigate coastal acidification and the negative impacts to the environment. With that said, with also decreasing the amount of CO2 we're putting into the air, we can also decrease the amount of ocean acidification. Next, please. So now to bring it into the context of Florida. So Florida watersheds are extensive and they have inherently low pH. So it's that fresh water that has the low pH has less of an ability to protect or buffer against acids. That's the decreasing pH, and large amounts of organic matter add CO2 back into the water as they decay. So while the water is fresher and coming into the coastal zone, it's also providing a lot of organic matter coming off of the land mass. So that there's a lot of terrestrial organic matter that's just ready and waiting to decay in the coastal zone. There's another bright note here that warm, salty subtropical waters that surround Florida on both sides do have a higher ability to protect against acidic conditions than, say, colder water that's found farther north. So what does that mean in the context of climate? Well, since climate models are predicting warmer and wetter conditions, and we saw a little bit of that in our earlier presentations today, that the stronger cyclones, that we can expect to have more freshwater input into the coastal zone and likely more organic matter brought into the coastal zone that can then decay and release CO2. So what does that mean for Florida? Well, we have to be concerned about our coral reefs, our mangrove systems, and of course, seagrass beds. Next slide, please. So I bring up seagrass beds because there's a great example of from Tampa Bay. In the late 80s, is the picture on the left shows, there was a lot of blue-green algae that was overtaking the seagrass beds, and that was due to land use change and enhanced nutrient sources around the bay, which fueled increased primary production, which is that removal of CO2 by photosynthesis. But on the downside of that, it also caused a lot of organic matter breakdown, which then released an excess amount of CO2 to the water, which favored the growth of blue-green algae and other algae rather than seagrass. But with the cleanup of the bay and lower nitrogen levels, seagrass beds throughout Tampa Bay kind of started to come back, and seagrass beds take up a lot more CO2 and actually store it, and are because these are vascularized plants that have a longer life cycle. So they take the CO2 out of the bay and actually work to reduce the increase the acidity. So that means, the pH scale is opposite. So it's going to reduce the acidity and increase the pH to the more basic water that we would prefer to see rather than acidified water. Next slide, please. So in Tampa Bay, fairly recently, within the last 5 to 6 years, hourly measurements have been taken because the USGS and the University of South Florida have worked together to establish 2 monitoring sites. One is a buoy offshore, that's about 55 miles offshore, and that kind of gets the ocean, like what's going on with ocean acidification. And then there's a fixed piling within Tampa Bay that monitors for coastal acidification. Unfortunately, we don't have enough long-term data yet to know if pH is decreasing on longer timescales, but we do have some information that these monitoring sites have given us so far, and we know that pH within Tampa Bay is lower than offshore. So we are seeing lower pHs and more acidity in the coastal zone. Next slide, please. So going down into the Florida Reef Tract, what do we know is that, so that yellow star represents the location of the Chica Rocks mooring, which is a NOAA-funded acidification monitoring site. And just from the few years of data that we have from Chica Rocks, we know that seasonal temperature increases and increased organic matter decay elevate the CO2. So it adds CO2 to the water, which is then decreasing the pH. Again, we don't have enough data yet to be able to look at pH or acidification at that site, but we're working on it because that is a mooring that is continuously monitoring. Then we've also been able to get some information from some laboratory studies. So the 2 staghorn coral one was grown at a lower pH of about 7.7, which is the smaller of the 2. And the larger one was grown at a pH that's closer to ocean pH of 8.2 over the same period of time. So we can see that low pH is going to inhibit coral growth. Next slide, please. So continuing on with the reef track, we are already seeing erosion. So that's basically either dissolution of the calcium carbonate structure of corals or a decrease in the growth. And so all of that red area in this map, and it's very hard to see the blue, which is the accretion or the addition of hard structure. So what does that really mean, apart from any impacts to tourism, is that the loss of reef structure can directly impact how hard waves hit our shorelines. So those reefs act to decrease the amount of wave energy. So that can impact all of, any kind of man-made structures. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about this? So the different coastal acidification networks from around the country, along with various different federal agencies, got together in the last few years, and we are in the process of producing something called the National Acidification Vulnerability Assessment, which looks at 3 different impacts to coastal communities. It's the exposure, which is the impact to marine ecosystems and resources, which is dependent on local ecosystem vulnerability. The social vulnerability, which is the dependence of social and economic systems on marine resources. And then the biological impacts or biological response, which is the impact of ocean acidification or coastal acidification on different species, habitats, and ecosystems. There is a barcode on this screen. So if you're interested in reading the vulnerability summary, the full report is not out yet, but you can read a summary for Florida, because Florida is actually covered by 2 different coastal acidification networks, the Gulf of Mexico and the Southeast. So, but this barcode will take you to a summary. I believe it's the Gulf side. Next slide, please. So under exposure, we want to know what the current and future levels of acidification are in the region. And so a few years ago, we SOCAN got together and put together a monitoring report of where is monitoring occurring and where does it need to happen. So all of those little bubbles with numbers are where we have determined that monitoring should be taking place. The red stars are where it's actually taking place. And the yellow circles are where there are projects that have just gotten started so that we can add those into our repertoire in the near future. But we realized that this report needs to be updated because it's now 6 years old and the state of acidification has continued to progress in the entire region. Next, please. So when we talk about that biological response, we're interested in understanding the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of organisms and ecosystems to acidification. So it says biological response gaps because we're trying to identify where do we need to do research and where do we need information. So you can see that there's very little overlap between the economically important species that have been identified, species that have been studied, and wild species that we know have already been impacted. So within that yellow circle, we would really like to see more information, and we just don't have it yet. So we know that there are these large gaps in our information. Next, please. So keeping in that mindset of what do we do if we have a severe acidification event that could potentially impact economies? Well, of all of the jobs that are associated with the recreational and commercial fishery industry within the region, there are over 84,000 jobs that could be impacted just in Florida alone. $4.4 billion worth of employment income and $21.7 billion in gross sales. And that the sales are with any like fish species, when you go to the fish store and you buy fish, or if you go to the bait and tackle shop to buy rods and reels and bait. So the question becomes, how would the loss of the fishing industry affect jobs, personal income, and state tax revenue? Well, we have to be able to identify what people or how people perceive this potential threat. Next slide, please. So that brings us to a project, and I apologize, I forgot to put it on this slide. This project that SOCAN and the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Acidification Network are partnering on is actually also it's advised by the by CHNEP and Jennifer Hecker, and I do apologize for not putting it on this slide, but if you go to this project website, you'll see all of the information on the project. But basically what we're doing is we're partnering over a one-year period to gauge stakeholder perception of acidification, identify locations where acidification monitoring is needed, and provide information on stakeholders' monitoring priorities to policymakers and government funding agencies. So we're planning to gather basically your concerns and your perception and what you think needs to be done to help address acidification, and present that to NOAA and other federal agencies to help ensure that as we're going forward with acidification research, that we are keeping in mind what stakeholders need and want. So that's the project website. And then next slide, please. This link and QR code would take you directly to a Google form, and which is the questionnaire that is associated with our project over the last year, where you can give us your feedback directly. The survey takes about 10 to 15 minutes, but we would really appreciate you not only taking it, but you can send this link to anybody else that you think would be interested in participating and helping us determine where acidification research and monitoring needs to occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana.
My name is Nicole Iadevaia. Today I'll be presenting on behalf of the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. I serve currently as Director of Research and Restoration for the CHNEP. The CHNEP works together with federal, state, and local governments, as well as scientists, resource managers, community members, and nonprofits in order to educate, restore, and protect water resources throughout Central and Southwest Florida on common issues. So what we wanted to talk about a little bit today is how we are currently addressing regional watershed changes and how we can bring in some of this, the best available science, this great science that's created by a lot of our partners, and we heard from some of those partners today, and incorporate that into some of our planning efforts as we work to restore watersheds within our region that are already highly altered. So what are the current issues that we're facing? So you can see here that there's a lot of natural flow along the landscape that has been altered by man-made systems, including roadways, development. We've done some ditching and draining. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in the next slide when we're talking about freshwater flows. So we're already working to sort of try and restore some of these watersheds to more historic conditions and restore some of the functions of these waterways, of these wetlands to better serve human populations, animal populations, as well as habitats, so they can engage in some of the work that they would normally do of aquifer recharge, as well as water cleansing. So changes in climate are also going to change how water moves through the land, how it moves through our waterways and through our atmosphere. These impacts are going to be seen in our aquifers, our rivers, our wetlands, and again, our watersheds. So, you know, a healthy hydrology, which is what we're aiming for, is a factor in creating healthy natural systems with appropriate freshwater flows to sustain these ecosystems and communities. And it's going to be highly dependent on kind of building for the new normal. What is climate going to look like in the future? So again, going back to some current issues we're already facing, there's multiple alterations in the CHNEP area. So again, we're focusing right now on Central and Southwest Florida, but we see some of the same issues that can be found across the state, similar to what's going on in the Everglades. There's a lot of natural sheet flow that occurred in this area, as you can see from that graphic there, that was sort of altered, and some of that flow is not reaching some of those wetlands closer to the coast, those tidal creeks, which also means it's not going out to our estuaries. Instead, it's getting impounded a little bit further upstream, and then potentially even causing some flooding issues for communities that are nearby. So again, these are some of the issues that we're facing: draining and filling of wetlands, dredging and filling of estuaries. There's been damming, diking, straightening, and widening of waterways. We've also seen natural waterways diverted into even completely different watersheds. That graphic kind of illustrates that there's some water that's being sent south towards the Caloosahatchee River area that wasn't necessarily sent that way, historically. Additionally, hardening of natural pervious surfaces. So this is hardening of ground that would normally help water to percolate in and to recharge our aquifers. That's changed some of the functions of our region. We are also withdrawing from these water systems for consumptive use. We're withdrawing groundwater for human use. So again, these are some of the issues we're looking to already currently address, getting closer to historical conditions for our region. So these changes in freshwater flows are also going to be compounded by increased salinity along the coast. So these are some clips from a recent sea level rise modeling study that the CHNEP undertook with a number of our partners. And so this was looking at how sea level rise would, using some of the NOAA numbers, how it would impact our area more specifically. And so you can see as we move from 2016 to 2040, you can see some of those habitats. For instance, mangroves are in red, and you can see how some of those mangroves are starting to shift upslope and inland in response to rising sea levels, because there's going to be less places for them to grow. So they're going to start to move and push those habitats that were naturally a little bit upslope further inland. And then you look at that final image there in 2070, eventually what happens is those habitats continue to get pushed upslope and upland, and eventually they get pinched out between sea level rise and hardened development. So again, we're kind of fighting this battle between decreased, in some cases, freshwater flows out, while saltwater is intruding up into these waterways. And so that's going to have major impacts on the habitats that are dependent on these waterways. Additionally, let's talk about wetlands in need. So there's going to be, there already are changes in wetland hydroperiods due to some man-made alterations. This is a really great graphic that was produced by one of our partners, and we used it in a recent study, examining basically what are the needs of the different vegetative communities that live in our wetlands and keep our wetlands healthy and produce some of those wetland functions. And they grow in highly specific elevations, and I'll show you that on the next slide. And they also thrive with highly specific hydroperiods. So a hydroperiod is essentially the amount of time that water spends on the landscape. And so when those are altered, those wetlands and those areas don't function in the way that they should. And so you can start to see, we've done some studies, you can see signs of stress in plants that are growing in areas that they traditionally grew in, but now are, experiencing either way too much water or not enough water. And so wetlands are also really impacted by water depths. So again, if we're piling up water in certain areas and then other areas are being starved for water, you're going to start to see that we're losing some of those ecosystem functions that wetlands naturally do for us, the water cleansing, the aquifer recharge, that are really important and useful. And it also helps, if the water is in the wetlands, then it's not getting shot right out to the river without undergoing any sort of cleansing, and it's not going to be flooding downstream communities potentially as well. So wetlands are really important in protecting when we're looking at watershed restoration for the future. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the problems that we're looking to address, how are we within our region organizing around solutions? So there are planning efforts underway to balance the reality of human alterations to the region. with the need for continued economic growth and stability, while maintaining quality of land, water, and life in local communities, as well as adapting to climate impacts. So we're kind of trying to balance all of these things. This makes it a really complex, multifaceted problem that we're looking to address. So naturally, we need to bring in anybody and everybody that is working in our region on solutions. We need to bring everyone together. You know, water doesn't follow jurisdictional boundaries. So we need to be working with land use planners, ecologists, transportation planners, water resource managers. We need to be working with land acquisition programs, NGOs, wildlife managers all throughout our region, and bringing all of these different people who work in all of these different jurisdictions together under one umbrella to fix one watershed, which again can cross all of these multi-jurisdictions. There's also something that we need to keep in mind is there is limited time and funding for a lot of these types of projects. So what we're looking to do is focus our partners in on some of the most strategic types of planning and projects that are going to have the most impact, the largest impact, and affect the most communities moving forward. So that's where we come in. So the CHNEP, as Jennifer mentioned previously, we work throughout Central and Southwest Florida. Our jurisdiction is actually guided by watershed boundaries. So we are a public-private partnership. We work on consensus-based science and solutions. We're non-regulatory. And again, we're trying to bring all of these regional partners together to collaborate and plan on some of these projects. So we have a 5-year strategic plan. That plan is actually built by all of the partners that make up the CHNEP. So again, a lot of those people that were on the last slide. So we focus on water quality improvement, hydrological restoration, fish, wildlife, and habitat protection, as well as public engagement. And as you may have guessed, I'm going to focus today a little bit more on the hydrological restoration action. I mean, all of these things are going to be impacted by some of this work in some way or another. So the CHNEP's vision, this was again built by all of those stakeholders for what we'd like to see in our region in Central and Southwest Florida, is appropriate freshwater flows across the landscape to sustain healthy wetlands, rivers, and estuaries. So the strategy that we're using is to support data-driven watershed planning and hydrologic restoration projects to protect and restore natural flow regimes and provide sufficient fresh surface and groundwater to natural systems. So how are we doing that? So the CHNEP region actually has a number of watershed initiatives. They're coming to mind right now. There's the Mayaca Watershed Initiative. There's the South Lee County Watershed Initiative. There's the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Watershed Initiative, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. There's also a lot of Everglades watershed initiatives that are working within our region. So the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, I'm going to kind of use this as sort of a case study for you all today, because we accomplished a lot with this project in the last couple of years. And we're really excited to show you the results of this project and how these could be carried forward in other regions and how this similar methodologies could be implemented in other parts of Florida or across the country even. So Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative focuses in on, you can see in that yellow circle there, that is the eastern wall of Charlotte Harbor. It spans a couple of different counties. It includes Babcock Webb and Yucca Penn's wildlife management areas. So this is some agency lands. It overlaps 2 water management districts. We work with both the South and Southwest water management districts in Florida. And then also where this water is going is impactful to multiple municipalities and communities that live both south of there and east of there as well. So, and again, any sort of restoration that's done in this area is going to be impactful to habitats, waterways. There's a number of tidal creeks that feed Charlotte Harbor that are impacted by this work, as well as different wetland ecosystems, including cypress swamps and pine flatwoods. So zooming a little bit further in, what are the changes? What are the issues we're seeing in the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods region? Why are we planning around this? So you can see here, these pictures, I think, just really illustrate the problem. So in the middle, you can see the area that we modeled and built a plan for. And again, so that's the Caloosahatchee River on the southern end of that, and that's Charlotte Harbor there on the left. And so Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area is in the upper right, and you can see just how wet that Pine Flatwoods area is most of the year. That is way too wet. Calling back to that graphic that we were just showing you of like wetlands and what types of hydro periods and water depths they need, that is not it. So we call this the South Walken area. I think FWC dubbed it that because you cannot drive in there, obviously. So, and then so water is kind of artificially piling up over there. You can see that that land is on the other side of 75 and 41 roadways. And then a little bit further south in the Yucca Pens area, you can see that is actually a cypress swamp and marsh area historically, and that is way too dry. So a lot of the water that's up here in Babcock Webb is not reaching this Yucca Pens area, to put it more simply, essentially. So what we're looking to do is restore some of the natural flow while again working around roadways and communities that are already existing to move that water back to where it needs to be, where it's doing harm to where it can do good. So CHNEP worked with the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative to find funding for a hydrological modeling and planning project. So what we wanted to do was create an integrated surface and groundwater model for the region and to figure out how we can get the water right in this area. We could see that there were problems, but there wasn't a lot of data collection for this region yet. So we needed to go in and collect the data. And then we needed to see, what's going on currently. Where is water going currently? How is it moving? We needed to compare that to historic conditions. And then we needed to figure out what types of restoration were going to be the most effective moving forward. Where our surface and groundwater is going to move in response to some potential projects that people were discussing. And then we wanted to examine that against some potential climate factors. And again, we looked at some of the data that's provided by our partners to do so. So the outcomes was to highlight planned restoration efforts that will be most impactful to healthy hydrology going forward. And again, you can see there we were looking for sheet flow enhancements, water quality improvement, aquifer recharge, flooding reduction, and hopefully nutrient uptake as well. So water cleansing. So this is how after we gathered a lot of data, this involved a lot of installation of groundwater monitoring stations, rainfall monitoring stations, flow gauges. We collected data for a couple of years. This is a really massive project. Then we went on to map the historical soils and to better understand and looking at vegetation indicators to understand what was going on in this region historically. And then we compared that to what we found was going on with current conditions when we plugged that into the model. And finally, what we did is partners had a number of projects that they were considering for restoration, and we wanted to help them understand, again, which projects that they should focus their limited time, efforts, and funding on. And so we modeled those projects. And so finally, what we also wanted to do is examine when we implement these projects potentially, will they help buffer the worst impacts of climate change for this region? Because the thought is that, the impacts that we're already seeing are only going to be exacerbated by climate impacts within the region. And so we wanted to see if we could do some of these restoration scenarios, will they help these wetlands withstand the future changes? It's almost like when your roof is damaged during Hurricane Ian, and then you have a tarp on your roof and Hurricane Nicole comes through, your roof is not as well set up to withstand the rain, and you may sustain further damage. So what we're looking to do is fortify those roofs for the future, and so that they can be a little bit more resilient when we see these repeated impacts come through our region. So moving on to some of what we found. So this is zooming into the model of the Babcock Webb area. So this is, again, the area that was way too wet. And what we found is when we modeled some partner projects, they did help reduce the hydro periods and water depths for Pine Flatwoods ecosystem. So that's, again, bringing these ecosystems closer to optimum conditions for that vegetation that's already existing and helping habitats. So we did see that these projects did, produce some great results. And you can see that how the yellow there, that's again the reduced hydro period. And then one of the projects that we modeled was something that the South Florida Water Management District has invested a lot of time and funding into, acquiring that region and then putting in a potential water storage project. And so all the water is being concentrated in there and removed from some of these wetlands. And so now zooming into the Yucca Pens region, all of that pink throughout there is basically cypress swamp area. And you can see how those hydro periods are now increasing, which is bringing those areas back closer to optimum conditions for the vegetation that's there. So basically now there's more water coming into this wetlands, and there's more water storage in this wetland. So that's helping the wetland itself. But then there's also more water available to leave and flow out to these starved tidal creeks that are coming out of Yucca Pens wetland, which was another goal of the project. So again, you can see there that's we quantified the acreage that is improved by some of these projects. So that was the additive of the project you saw on the previous slide, plus a partial seepage barrier that might go in this area, some natural ditch blocks or low flow weirs that might go in this area. And, we're happy to say that some of these projects have already moved forward to construction. Some of them might be moving forward to planning and design stages. And, not in small part to some of the results from this modeling, because it really helped us formulate around some real actual recommendations for the region. So again, this is just looking at what were we looking to restore and how, did the outcomes from the modeling show that we were meeting our project objectives. So yes, we did look to reduce impounded water on Babcock Webb. Yes, we did address increasing water depths in Yucca Pens. And yes, we did enhance wildlife habitat both in Babcock Webb, and we looked at fish. We also enhanced fisheries in those tidal creeks, because again, if you have water really flushing out of those tidal creeks at a high rate, or actually and alternately being starved, which is a flashiness, that is not great habitat for our snook and tarpon that are highly dependent on these fisheries and also impactful to the economy. So it kind of addressed a lot of different problems. So, and finally, we compared all of these results to a variety of different climate change scenarios. As was mentioned before, we compared it to a variety of rainfall scenarios, a variety of evapotranspiration scenarios, and sea level rise scenarios. And what we saw is that these projects really help these areas hold up under changing climate conditions, under a number of scenarios. So, you can kind of see there, I kind of scaled out with this last map. You can see some areas are a little bit drier than they used to be in Babcock Webb, and those wetlands are now rehydrated down towards Yucca Pens. So we kind of have that bullet right there, but the complexity and cost of implementing these large scale projects requires multi-partner phased approach that will span years. But this planning process was the first step to help us formulate around what we need to do next. So I just wanted to, again, thank all of the partners that were involved in this planning project. As I mentioned, we're already moving forward with some of these restoration projects, which is really exciting to see. And I want to invite you all, if you're in this region, to be a part of these initiatives. If you're not in this region, to think about replicating these types of initiatives in your region. And again, thank you to all the partners that helped build this. This is not done by CHNEP staff alone. This is done by the entirety of the partnership for many years to build this one particular plan. But if you'd like to learn more, go ahead and use that QR code, and you can visit our Water Atlas website, where we have anything and everything, the report, the model files, anything that you would like to look into following this. So again, thank you all for your time and for allowing me to share this with you all.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Now we get to hear from you all. We have a sizable amount of time that we have reserved for Q&A so that we could really have interaction with you to hear what your questions are with regards to rainfall, evapotranspiration, hydrological changes, ocean acidification. These are very important climate stressors that are going to affect our region if they aren't already. And so we want to take your questions, and I know these might be a little hard to read, but I welcome the panelists to look at the screen. If you see a question, feel free to jump in here. I'll just go down here and try to read as many as I can, starting with Dr. Maran. Is your regional climate model effort and data being incorporated and or shared with the Flood Hub Rainfall Working Group?
Yes, so the plan that we have right now going on is to expand the exact same approach that was done for South Florida to the entire state. And we are working at the Florida Flood Hub Rainfall Working Group to get all the pieces coordinated, approved, and moving forward. We are beginning this work. So yes, what we have as phase one of Florida Flood Hub is to expand what we did in South Florida to the whole state.
Wonderful. Are we in a drought in Southwest Florida or not?
That's a big question, and we have many ways to answer it. Right now, we are not in a drought. In the last governing board meeting at South Florida Water Management District, we saw some initial indications that we have some groundwater levels going down. They are not significant yet. We are monitoring, and we continue with the overall recommendation of everybody conserving water year round.
Next is regarding restoring natural sheet flow. How can we shift away from reliance on man-made canals towards natural hydrological features?
Is that for me?
Anyone who wants to take it?
I mean, I would just speak to our specific project. That's exactly what we were looking to do, is move water back into our wetlands. I mean, you do have to factor in different communities that have been built, roadways that have been built, but we found that we were able to install through the project different culverts that would go underneath 75 in different areas. So again, kind of more of a sheet flow version, a sheet flow light to get some of that water from the Babcock Webb area over to Yucca Penn. So that's one example of doing that.
Yeah, and I could just say that I know that some of the people I work with, they're doing some work up in the Panhandle area with Fish and Wildlife Service to remove some of the structures that are in some of the streams up there, dams that just really low that go all the way across, and anyways, returning to the natural flows up there. So that's, I know up in that area, they're trying to do some of that kind of work.
Yeah.
All right, the next question is, do you anticipate changes in monthly distribution of rainfall, wet season starting earlier or later?
Yes, if you want to jump, go first.
Well, yeah. So, you know, some of these climate models that we're talking about are trying to address this kind of issue. We've been working with Florida State University with Basu Mishra, and he's been talking about how the timing of the wet season could change the initiation of monsoons. A lot of it is tied to what is the temperatures in the Gulf. Anyways, that's one of those things with these climate models that we're trying to address right now, and he's been seeing some changes there.
Yeah. And we look at monthly too. So we have trends for rainfall at each month of the year. And we do have some months that we are observing. October is one that I pop in my mind right now, where we are seeing like really a reduction in how rainfall was occurring.
Interesting. The next one is channeling creeks to adapt to wet season isn't a good choice due to ecological impacts in dry season. How do we find a balance, and what kind of projects do you advise for local governments? I think this is somewhat related to the idea before, just about what are the alternatives to channelization?
So some of the watershed initiatives that we have worked with have also, some of those local governments have worked to acquire additional properties that are along that flow path that allow us to do a little bit more natural restoration, so you don't have to go straight to ditching and draining. Obviously, you cannot flood downstream communities, but that's an alternative. I mean, one of the things that we examined with our modeling is the Water Management District acquired a few properties, and it allowed us to move the water in a way that was a little bit more natural, because you're going to have to do that on public lands. You wouldn't be doing that on private lands.
Someone asked, so are you saying we're headed towards more drought and monsoon seasons?
We don't have all the data yet to say that. And the way we approach is really by evaluating and having the science to support. We have some initial indications when we look at data and observe data, but we are beginning the work right now to really can make an affirmation that we are heading to more droughts. Like we have initial data that we are looking at in terms of observed data, but we really need to understand, digest, evaluate all those climate models to understand what they're telling us and what that means to Florida and how, which month, when. So it's a lot of questions that we need to be able to really have the technical scientific data to support. So too early to give a very strong response to this question.
Are higher temperatures raising metabolism in plants and rising evapotranspiration? Or in the other hand, is improving plant growth and raising storage within plants?
Yeah, so
I'm sorry.
oh, sorry. Yeah, I would say that so there's potentially a lot of stuff going on with plants there, right? You know, part of it is the CO2, part of it is the temperature change and so on. And so what you could have is, so there's certain things where the like what I had talked about, that the stomata resistance of the plants for moving water changes, but you also have things like, you know, leaf area index, where the plants just become more prolific, right? I don't know if that's maybe addressing metabolism, but it kind of is, right? That the plants could just grow. From what I've looked at, the limited amount that I've looked at that side of things, is that as the temperatures increase and the CO2s increase, more of a situation is how quickly can something grow in and really quickly fill up like a burned area, right? You know, there's certain limits that plants have. You can only fit so many blades of grass into an area, right? Or things along those lines. But if you do have a disturbance, things can come over recover pretty darn fast. And I recall getting a paper from, I think it was University of Central Florida, where they were looking at least increasing CO2, not necessarily the increasing temperatures, but the plants really kind of filled out in that tent that had the CO2. But I don't know if I can address whether or not the metabolism of the plant goes up, other than to say that there are some people that are looking at the plants become greener, that they get more leaves, that kind of thing. And it looks like there's a question along those same lines right below it there. Is there anything your team has theorized?
Dr. Stamm, is there anything your team has theorized to be done to change the evapotranspiration rate? For example, to increase the rate to assist with intense rain events? And I would piggyback on this to ask that some of our modeling was based on some literature that talks about projected increased evapotranspiration. We're not observing that yet based on the data that you presented today, but, you know, do you foresee that as a potential? What do we need to do to kind of continue to understand what the, you know, is possible with regards to evapotranspiration changes?
Yeah, so so a lot of the work that's been done on evapotranspiration has been done kind of in the realm of agriculture. So we put out like one of these eddy covariance stations, and they sit out there for maybe 10 years, and we get data, we figure out how much does this crop evaporate out and all that kind of stuff. And we've done that in several different sites across Florida. And I showed you some of the data, like from Lake Okeechobee, for example, that has that kind of stuff in it. But the problem is when you have 10 years here and 15 years here and 5 years there and so on, it's really hard to take a look at that stuff and look at trends, right? And that's where we kind of need to design some of our approach to evaporation with looking at trends in mind. The equations for reference evapotranspiration are based on an equation from 1998, and it assumes this kind of resistance to plants that has no response to CO2. And it just takes that, it responds to the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, but not CO2 changing. So we have to incorporate that. And I say, as you look at evaporation that's been computed over the years, you kind of assume that the albedo of the surface is this, and then suddenly, oh, now there's a satellite that we can get the albedo at a 1 kilometer resolution. Let's add that in. Let's add in a better satellite for solar radiation, so on. So things improve over the years, but when you look at that, for looking at trends, it's tough. And that's where I'm kind of saying that we're in the process of really trying to kind of clean this stuff out so we can really look at what's going on with evaporation, try to bring in the CO2 effect. So one of the things I've proposed with our stuff is, for example, to incorporate the CO2 into some of these standard equations that just hasn't been there before. And I'll mention this, that there's a thing that I just recently learned about, and there's a thing called, I think they call it the China effect, right? So in China, they look at pan evaporation, right? And they're looking at trends in their pan evaporation data, and actually it's going down, right? It's going opposite, right? And that's pan evaporation. But what they're saying is that there's humidity and wind effects that are counterbalancing the temperature effects. So I would say that, it may not intuitively work in the directions that you think of, and that's what's going on. That's what they're seeing in China. I read a paper about that in the Netherlands and so on, right? So I could say the answer to this is that we're trying to get better estimates to incorporate a lot of this stuff into so we could really look at trends where, you know, everything is done consistently and we have the CO2 in there and all that, and then kind of decide what we can do. I may have danced around that answer, but
No, that's good. No, I would just say that for those of you who may not understand like the significance of evapotranspiration, it can be if you put it into these models, a big driver in understanding how much storage you need, for instance, because it can change surface water levels and groundwater levels based on rates of evapotranspiration. So it is something we really need to understand in order to adequately prepare and adapt. Yeah. So I appreciate you kind of sharing with us that we have some uncertainty and we need to keep having these types of meetings annually to get updated science and build our understanding about some of these things that we're just right now uncertain or unclear about from a scientific standpoint. Yeah. So, you know, working with Carolina in this Florida Flood Hub, and we're actually doing a 1975 to 2020 simulation, real high resolution. We started that work, and boy, that's going to really add a lot of data that can use to get a really good ET time series. And we're actually already doing that. We've done it for 2021 and 2022. And the other thing I'll just mention, while I've got the podium here, is that a lot of times evapotranspiration, when you're doing like a groundwater model or surface water model, it ends up being that kind of piece of the code that you can kind of tweak a lot, right? Mm-hmm.
You use it right. So you put that in there, and that's the thing that you put into the little statistical package that says, okay, bring that up and down so I match my observations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of revisiting some of that stuff. Is you don't want to get the right answer for the wrong reasons too, right? That actually is off. So, but that's kind of where evaporation it's kind of been that stepchild of models where it's kind of put in there and then you just kind of adjust it, right? So we're really working a lot on ET, probably in Florida more than anywhere else. Dave Sumner, who used to be our center director, he just retired, but he spent his career doing that, really kind of built up a program.
That's great. And we have some other questions here. Mangroves and other species are moving north. Are there plant species we need to be looking at to replace them?
I would say in our region, mangroves are they're proliferating. I would say, yeah, when you're looking a little bit northward towards Tampa Bay region, there is some modeling that's showing how it's pushing out salt marsh in those areas. I don't know. I don't personally have any thoughts on that. Obviously, it'd be great to, the tropicalization of habitats and species is definitely a documented phenomenon. We actually have a paper on that shared on our CHNEP website produced by some of our partners, but I don't know if there's any recommendations that you all know of for, other than battling that as best we can.
We have, I am not the expert to say that, and I'm going to summarize the information that I have, but we have a project that we are beginning. It's a pilot experiment to understand if we could make the existing mangroves more robust by adding some phosphorus at the right. Is that like, it's a tiny little amount, but monitoring this through sediments to see if we could accelerate peat accretion. So soil accretion, that it's not really related to moving mangroves, but really allowing them to maybe sustain themselves in the place, maybe slow a little bit movement inland, and also really creating a barrier somehow to sea level rise if you can naturally like allow the soil to raise. It's very early. It's a very tentative pilot that we are beginning to set up. We have a lot of steps to walk, but yeah, it's also related to this discussion.
Yeah, and I would point out the CHNEP a couple of years back did a habitat restoration needs project, which you can go on our website and look at, but it looks at climate projections and how different types of habitats, including mangroves, will shift over time. And in the long term, eventually some areas will be pinched out essentially from hitting developed areas. Like mangroves will migrate until they can no longer migrate.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's informative, you know, somewhat alarming, but also informative in that, you know, for habitat restoration projects, we're trying to build things that are durable, and understanding what is likely to unfold helps us to understand where we can help, number one, facilitate habitat migration through land acquisition, land conservation, those types of things, but also for restoration projects to make sure to place them in areas where the conditions will be conducive in the long term for their survival. The next one is U.S. Sugar says they can't grow sugar sustainably like they do in Brazil. Is this possible in our climate? Does anybody know about that? We do have an ag panel coming up, so that might be another question to ask later to the experts from the ag community, but if anybody has any thoughts. All right, we'll have to hold that one till later. Dr. Reimer, do you know of acidification study projects that include cultural resources? Acidification increases deterioration of shipwrecks, which are non-renewable resources and support marine ecosystems. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Reimer?
Well, the part on cultural resources, so there are many different types of cultural resources. We don't have anything going on that we right now on shipwrecks specifically. But we do partner with one of the cultural, I think they're considered federal, tribal, the Gullah Geechee, on the eastern side of our region. They range from Jacksonville, North Carolina, down to Jacksonville, Florida. It's called the Gullah Geechee Corridor, and they're very active in acidification projects and awareness from the cultural aspect of how the Gullah Geechee use the sea and what it means to them spiritually, as well as a source of subsistence fishing. But I am not aware of anything that's going on with shipwrecks.
All right, thank you. And then the next question is, do accidents like Piney Point change the pH significantly? Can you speak to that, Dr. Reimer?
They can. Sometimes it's on a short term, and it depends on what the flushing time would be of that particular body of water, that embayment. On long-term scales, for what we consider to be, you know, like a long-term decrease in pH, they're kind of a blip. But the more blips that we have, the more it's going to impact the long-term trend. And the long-term trend is that's the climate issue of it.
Okay, thank you. How does phosphate mining impact river quality in the county where it is done, and then consequently to water resources downstream?
Well, I guess from an acidification perspective, and this question might be answered better with under another topic, but directly phosphate itself is not going to have as much of an impact on acidification upstream, but in the any kind of disruption of like sediments and soils, and that disruption could also be from sea level rise, is going to have more of an impact by delivering organic matter to the coastal zone. And once that organic matter has gotten down to the coastal zone and kind of resides in a body of water for an extended period of time, the decay can put CO2 back into the water. Photosynthesis is always going to take up the nutrients. So phosphate itself in the usable form by marine organisms or even freshwater organisms, as long as the nutrient ratios stay constant, isn't going to impact the water quality as far as organic matter and acidification. Now, there might be another answer to that from another perspective.
Yeah, I would just say from a water quality perspective, all sources of excess nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus, whether it be from phosphate mining, from agricultural runoff, from stormwater runoff, from wastewater overflows and septic leaching, all of those are contributing to eutrophication of our waterways, which we know is increasing the intensity, severity, and frequency of harmful algae blooms like we're experiencing right now. So we really are at CHNEP focused on working with every single source, potential source, and known documented source of excess pollution, excess nitrogen, phosphorus, nutrient pollution, to try to reduce those in our waterways. And we do keep dialogue open with the phosphate industry, with local governments, with all the different stakeholders who would be responsible for those different types of inputs, and are constantly working with them to try to encourage them to make whatever investments are needed to reduce those inputs, because we know that is a widespread problem affecting our whole region, and we take it very seriously. Do you have a comment? Yes.
Yeah, I just thought I'd add that, historically, the phosphate mining, especially with the big open pit, would really affect groundwater levels. And then historically, there have been certain streams, I think they're part of the Peace River, for example, that basically just went dry, right? Springs just stopped flowing, that kind of thing. But what has been good is to see the recovery since then, that there really has been a recovery. We've been looking at some of the groundwater levels over the years since the 70s and 80s, and you could see the groundwater levels recovering as they pull their water from other sources or no longer have to pump, right, to keep those dry. But that in the past, that has been an effect that Florida has been recovering from.
That's good to know.
I just wanted to add on to what you said, Jennifer, really quickly about harmful algal blooms, is that harmful algal blooms after the decay of the bloom can certainly directly affect the pH of the water. So it's considered a multi-stressor, and there's a lot of research that still needs to be done, but I think it just highlights the overall synergistic cumulative issue of acidification, because it isn't just affected by one factor. There are many aspects that can trigger an acidification event and also help reduce it. So the harmful algal bloom on top of an already low pH is going to certainly drive the pH down farther. So thanks for bringing that up.
I'm going to end up talking too much here.
No, go right ahead.
I just thought I'd mention this because we've got a woman, Viviana Mazzi, who's doing she works on harmful algal bloom. She's out of our Orlando office and is doing quite a bit of work. And so I've been supervising her and learning a fair bit of stuff. And I just thought I'd give this perspective of the kind of way they're thinking is that, you know, when they see something like a lake or a red, I don't know if it's so much a red tide, but when you suddenly get all this algae everywhere, they start to think that the system is kind of going back to a primitive state and it's getting its primitive response to that, right? So that's kind of one way to think about things, that you're bringing things back to kind of a harsher water that is kind of more primitive. What survives best there is the algae, right? So they're kind of looking at things from that perspective as well. And maybe being more acid could be part of that, or, you know, other things in it, like the amount of oxygen available in the water and so on. But I just thought I'd add that perspective of how they're viewing, right, how these systems are responding, right?
And that's a great perspective, because there are many species of phytoplankton that the basis of harmful algal blooms that do better metabolically in a high CO2 environment. So the higher the CO2, the even greater the bloom capacity is. And that's why some of these species just start to outcompete other species, because they're happier in that higher CO2 environment. And then you get dominance of that particular species, hence the bloom.
Yeah, and I would just say there's a lot of things in complexity where there's vicious cycles. For instance, like you get too much nutrients, you get chlorophyll that can inhibit light growth for light for growth of seagrasses. Seagrasses can lower pH. You get the seagrasses dying off, and then you get a conversion sometimes, as we've seen in cases like the Indian River Lagoon, where a seagrass dominated system can tip over to an algae dominated system, whether that be macroalgae or whatnot. And so then it's really hard to bring it back sometimes when something goes over that tipping point. And I think that there's a lot of people in Central and Southwest Florida who are aware of our estuaries along this coast, seeing in some cases pretty dramatic seagrass losses. For instance, in 2018 to 2020, we lost roughly a third of the seagrass in Charlotte Harbor in 2 years, more than have been recovered since the 80s. So that's a red flag that we need to be doing more to double down to control the nutrient inputs, which really fuel a lot of these processes and kind of create a domino effect of changes to the ecosystem. So, and we also understand that, again, what we talked about before is that these can feed into whether or not a system is more or less resilient from a climate perspective. So the healthier we can rebuild our systems, the more able they are to adapt and to adjust and acclimate to climate changes. The more stressed they already are, the more unhealthy they already are, the less likely they are to be able to adapt. So we need to double down quickly to get our systems as healthy as possible, because they're already going to be dealing with these additional climate stressors. All right, so we have several for Nicole. Nicole, does your organization, I'm going to just read them off in sequence so you can answer a bunch of them. Does your organization work with wastewater quality at all? How might future development impact the Flatwoods Initiative? I'm sorry, they're not related, so I don't want to overload you. And then maybe I'll throw one more. Why choose consensus-based science, and how has it helped CHNEP's goal of carrying out public outreach and engagement?
Okay, no, I think they all do relate.
Okay,
so I'll weave you a tale for it. So basically working within consensus-based science allows us to when we're looking at the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, for example, if only a few of the partners are on board with the way that we're working to do these restoration plans or the science that we're bringing into it, we're not going to be able to get these larger outcomes that we're looking for if you only have one partner doing it this way and another partner doesn't want to be involved in the project because they don't like the science that's being brought in or they don't agree with it. And so we do have to move forward with initiatives that bring everyone to the table, because again, when we're looking at these large areas, you can't just have one county restoring, and there's counties upstream, and the work that they do is going to impact those counties further south. But their missions overall is not to worry about the other counties. You know, their mission is to help their own tax base. And so that's why we're bringing them together to the table to say, okay, you know, can we work together? What is the science that we can work together on and agree upon? And where do we see agreed upon issues? And I think that also kind of touches on, you know, the development within these areas. You know, working with our local partners on, you know, like where can we focus strategically on and opportunistically on acquiring lands and connecting these areas and making wildlife and waterway corridors. This is a great example of this is what's been done in the Myakka region. There's been, you know, there's Myakka River State Park, and then you have lands that have been acquired by different agencies, by different nonprofits to create this really great wildlife corridor, this green space. And so it allows a lot of these ecosystems to thrive. And I think we need to do the same thing when we're creating these like sort of waterway corridors, because again, you can't be moving this water through people's homes and through, you know, businesses and things like that. And so again, strategically, local governments investing in acquiring certain areas and doing projects in those areas that help create these pathways. Is really important. And that's why we're working together with all of them. And as far as the wastewater issue, that is something that, again, the CHNEP is not the program staff. It's not the 5 of us. The CHNEP is the partnership. So yes, the counties and cities and governments that are working on wastewater management and improving stormwater projects and installing wastewater treatment plants, they are involved in the CHNEP. And this is the plan they put together and said, we are committing to working on this in our region. And you can look at, you know, some of the resiliency plans that are coming together and comprehensive plans for our local counties. And that is one of the items is advanced wastewater treatment, expanding, you know, wastewater systems and moving from septic to sewer in strategic areas. So the partnership overall is working on wastewater treatment. The program office itself is not involved in that, but it is our partners' work.
Yeah, and I would just reinforce that we have a master plan, strategic plan for the organization called our Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. And it has a section devoted to wastewater where the partners in the partnership mutually committed to certain goals, like number 1, to get all facilities to advanced wastewater treatment. So, you know, we definitely see that mutual commitment. Now, it's a challenge to get the funding to implement all of the projects, but there is a consensus and a mutual commitment to do that. And it's what we work around, is trying to help bring added funds to implement projects that further our CCMP goals. Next is, which stressors are easiest to adapt to? What's the lower hanging fruit here?
I can start, and I think I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit, but I like one point that you made on how can we set up models in a way that they'll give us answers on the way that we really, that are substantially strong, like that are not just, we can use a model to play and create a scenario easily and have strong justifications, but they're still very wrong. And this is what we need to be very careful on really understanding what are the stressors that are not easy. First of all, let's try to understand what are the stressors and how we want to really model and capture them. The presentation from John today just pointed on the importance of getting it right, because I mean, we have to be able to build the scenarios that are the right one with the good science behind, that are going to lead us to the best interpretation of what the future is going to be, so we can take the right action, so we can take the best way to adapt. So for me, first of all, the first thing, if you want to really adapt to this, is to get the science right in the beginning and really make sure you are modeling and you're understanding how your system will be responding in the right way with the best available information. Maybe we don't have all the answers, but we are understanding the ranges. Like, we are modeling in a way that, okay, we don't know how much ET is going to change, but let's try. What if it does here? What if it goes there? What if it goes there? And then really think about how you can adapt and plan. Something that we are talking more and more is create adaptation plans that are flexible, that can be adapted. Like, really build your recommendations in a way that you are, I know what's going to happen until here. The information, I have more certainty of this is going to happen until 10 years or this habitat or in this type of scenario. So let's plan on the best strategy to adapt here, allowing us to bring new technology, innovation, other solutions that can be aggregated later. So bring flexibility on the way that you plan. It's hard. It's not an easy task, but I think we need to be open for that in everything we do, in the natural system, in the built system. Like when we're thinking about a seawall, we also need to be able to think about that. Like how can we bring flexibility? And in terms of low-hanging fruit for this question, I think the low-hanging fruit is really our capacity to bring all those alternatives, to bring all those possible scenarios so we can kind of move forward. The hard part is like having all the computational time, resources to test all the scenarios, and in the middle of this sea of solutions, understand where you want to adapt. I'm talking in a more modeling environment. This is where I navigate, but still, I think the low-hanging fruit is really our capacity to test all the scenarios, understand, and really plan better, because we know all the options, and we don't have the capacity yet to test all those possible scenarios that might happen. So,
I just want to say that was a really, that was wonderful. And I wanted to add on to that is like that consensus-based science is going to be stronger the more and more information you bring in and the more and more partners you bring into it, working on these issues too.
All right. And then we'll go to regarding, oh, wait, there's actually one for the district. I'll go over to that one. Does South Florida Water Management District anticipate using precipitation modeling and project permitting, ERP permitting, specifically thinking about stormwater management systems?
So the state is not yet bringing the data that we have for rainfall. It's not yet in a good certainty level that we can really bring to permitting, to regulation yet. The regulation team is working with us, and I think not only the regulation team, but even a lot of engineers understand those risks. They are bringing more and more to the discussions, but it's not official guideline, and it's not yet officially incorporated to ERP. Some counties are looking at that, and they are doing some responses. Broward County, where I used to work, did some analysis of like changes in rainfall and what does that mean in terms of changing groundwater level, for instance, and what does that mean in terms of stormwater permitting, and they do have some ordinances. But at the state level, please, we don't act alone as well. It's just not South Florida Water Management District. It has to be all 5 water management districts and the state working together. So the more data, the more science we have, I think the more we'll be able to navigate in this more regulatory world.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that, what do you base this on when you're making these precipitation, looking at decisions based on precip out in 28 or so on, and you're working with global climate models that probably at best have a grid spacing of about 50 kilometers or so. And if you want to get a sense of what kind of scales, so they kind of have like statistical equations to say, well, in that 50 kilometer, how much, given the stability atmosphere, how much rainfall might you get from a thunderstorm? But generally, if there's like a 5-time factor in terms of what scale process can you simulate, right? If you're simulating a wave in the atmosphere, you need 5 points: a low, a high, a middle, low, right? That's 5 points. So what USGS did is we got down to a 4-kilometer model that we're working on for the entire US. And what that did is that was able to pretty accurately simulate out these thunderstorms in the Midwest. But those can get big, right? Those are big. So 4 kilometers, looking at a 20-kilometer or so process that you can simulate. In Florida, we've got these, a thunderstorm kicks up because of a steep sea breeze, right? So that's why we're going to 1 kilometer. And once we have data like that, and think of it, the way I like to kind of explain it is that there's all of these models that are used to simulate a hurricane coming. And what you've found is that those 2 are the ones that we really watch because they seem to work best. So we're trying to develop a model that would be like those two for Florida that we really kind of have a lot more confidence in. So once you have that, then you can start thinking about probably enough resolution. You can think about getting into the permitting world and all that kind of stuff. But right now we're working with data that's like 50-kilometer precipitation data.
So I guess the take home is stay tuned. This is stuff that is evolving, and hopefully next year we'll have an update on some of this with some of the new data. But I just want to join me with giving me them a round of applause